I'd like to thank you for inviting me, and the first thing I want to say is that my hosts in Mapo district have been absolutely wonderful, and I found the last 2 days truly inspirational. I hope I'll be able to repay some of that, so thank you. Okay, my name is Steve Clare. My passion all of my adult life has been around community activism, around community economic development, around community enterprise. But until May of this year, I'd spent the previous 10 years as Deputy Chief Executive with an organisation called Locality. Locality is a network of multi-purpose community organisations working in England. We have sister organisations in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, the other 3 nations of the UK. In England, there are over 550 members of Locality, and between them, they own about £700 million of community-owned assets. That's about 1,200 billion won. Now, some of those members are large organisations, some are small, some are urban, some are rural. But between them, they employ about 10,500 people and work with 25,000 volunteers. What those Locality members have got in common are shared values and a belief in their communities. They're all community owned and they're led and accountable to their communities. They have a commitment to using community ownership and community enterprise to tackle poverty, deprivation, social exclusion, and to promote empowerment, engagement and self-help. The 2 most important words there were enterprise and ownership, because through enterprise and ownership, Locality members can be independent. They don't have to do what the local authority tells them to do. They can make their own mind up, and their communities can make their own minds up. By being entrepreneurial and running businesses, they can make profits to reinvest back into the community and to be sustainable. Now, this approach is still a minority in the UK, but it works. And as a result, government has listened to Locality and its members over the last 10 years. I'll give some examples in a few minutes, but if you look, for example, in the west of Scotland, the islands off the west of Scotland, 40% of the land is now in community ownership. And the evidence is clear. Independent studies have shown community-owned land is 250% economically more successful than privately owned land. Communities that were slowly dying are now growing again. Young people are staying there and new people are moving in. So as I say, the government has listened in Britain. And in 2007, there was a government report, the Quirk report, which recommended that local authorities should transfer underused land and buildings into community ownership. That was because Locality members had shown community ownership works. And the government set up something called the Asset Transfer Unit, which was managed by Locality, and we worked with over half of local authorities in England and many communities, and helped over 1,000 community assets, land and buildings, to get transferred into community ownership. Now, in the last 5 years, we've had a different government and a different approach, but they've still supported community ownership. One of their first initiatives is what they called Big Society. Has anyone here heard of Big Society? It was very big in England. Now nobody talks about it. Instead, what we talk about is localism. There was an Act of Parliament, there was legislation in 2011 called the Localism Act, and it introduced a series of community rights. The most important ones were the community right to bid, which allowed communities to list land and buildings that they thought were of community value, and the owners of those land and buildings couldn't sell them without a 6-month waiting period. What was particularly important about that was it includes privately owned land and buildings. And this delay of 6 months, if somebody wants to sell something that's been listed, allows the community time to try and raise the money to buy it for themselves. Now, like all government legislation that is aimed at communities, it is fundamentally flawed. Government legislation can never solve problems at a community level. But what it has done is create a lot more interest in the idea of community ownership. And a lot more people are saying we should get involved, our community should get involved in taking over and running what's important to our community. Locality manages the national support service for these community rights. And so far, about 2,600 assets of community value, which could be anything, 2,600 have been listed, put on this list whereby they're protected. And about 200 have now actually been bought and taken over by local communities. And I'll give an example or two in a little while. But this is happening in a wider context of austerity and cuts in public spending. In the UK and in most of Europe, we're seeing some fundamental changes taking place. The post-war consensus, the welfare state, the agreement, the model of an ever-expanding economy, ever-increasing taxes, ever greater public spend on services, that model is broken. And instead, governments are asking fundamental questions about who does what, who should do what, who's best placed to do what should the citizen do, what should the state do. For me, some of that is actually positive. I believe the more that decision making can be brought down to communities, the better. The more responsibility communities have for managing their own affairs, the better. But, and it's a very big but, not all communities are equal. Not all communities have the same skills, the same resources, the same capabilities, the same access to finance. And what we're seeing in the UK and much of Europe is it's the poorest communities who are being left further and further behind. And with this public sector spending, we've already seen local authorities have had a 40% cut in their budgets. Many think they will be half the size they are now by the end of the decade. And as part of that process, many local authorities are looking at getting rid of as many non-essential assets as they can. Community centres, libraries, parks, anything they can get rid of, they will. So there's a real danger if communities don't step forward and take over these assets, then they will be lost. That all sounds very depressing. I'm certainly unhappy with the prospect of future austerity policies, which I think are both poor economics and fundamentally wrong. But I'm also optimistic, and I can see a glimpse of a different sort of future. Out of austerity comes innovation and experimentation. And what we're seeing is the beginnings of what has been called the democratization of everything. I just want to step back and look at a couple of examples of community enterprises in England. This is Coin Street, which is on the south bank of the River Thames in central London, almost across the river from Parliament, if ever any of you have been to London. It started in 1977 when a small group of residents started campaigning against plans to build lots and lots of office blocks in the middle of their community. 7 years later, they were able to raise the money to buy the site themselves. They've transformed a largely derelict 55,000 square metre site into a thriving mixed-use neighbourhood. Up there, for example, they've set up 4 housing cooperatives. They've built 320 housing units, including some 5-bedroomed homes, all at affordable rent. They've redeveloped empty warehouses next to the river is just here, and turned it into a thriving retail site. This is a London landmark, the Oxy Tower. They have a major childcare site, childcare centre. They run their own bus service for residents, and they run a wide range of services for young people, for older people, family support, education, enterprise, a wide range of services for local people. It's amazing, but it's not stopping there. They have ambition. This is a community group, and they've now had permission, planning permission, to build a 40-storey block of apartments, an Olympic-sized swimming pool, and a new headquarters for a dance company, the Ballet Rambert. Ordinary people doing extraordinary things. This is the Goodwin Development Trust, which is based in a city called Hull, which is on the east coast of England. It's based in a large social housing estate. The board of directors, every single one of them, is a resident of that estate. No lawyers, no accountants, no outside experts, all local people. It has a turnover above £1 billion a year. It owns and manages 14 different buildings. That's their headquarters. But they rent space to the local authority and the health service, not the other way around. They run dozens of different services for local people, and they're actually the biggest non-public sector employer in the city. They employ over 300 people, a community organisation. But that's not enough. That is a picture of the Humber Bridge. When it was built in the 1970s, it was the biggest suspension bridge in the world. They tried to buy it 2 years ago. It's a bridge you have to pay to cross. A community organisation tried to buy that for £100 million, which is 175 billion won. It would have required legislation in government to make that happen, so the government said no, but that didn't deter them. That came next. They worked with a local inventor and developed this, which is called the Oxy Pod. For the past 3 years, it's been tested by several universities. It reduces central heating costs by 30%. They've been offered lots of money to buy the patent, but they've said no, they're going to manufacture it themselves. And what is even better, they're going to target sales of it to people in fuel poverty. That's a community organisation. This is the Ivy House, a pub. Are people familiar with the idea of the English pub? This was owned by a big company. They were going to sell it off and turn it into luxury apartments. The local community mobilised. They used the community right to bid to list the building, and then within 6 months they'd raised the money to buy it. Part of the package involved a community share issue where local people bought shares in the business, and it's now a very successful, thriving business. The one at the top is Hastings Pier. In the 19th century, the British had this strange habit of building these things out into the sea. They're basically a leisure facility, an entertainment facility. Yeah. This one was very important to the people of the town Hastings, but it was owned by some mysterious company that nobody could find, and then mysteriously it got burnt down. But the community took it over after a campaign, and they've raised £10 million. I have no idea what that is. That's probably about 1.2 billion won. And they're turning it into, again, an entertainment facility, but also a basis for social enterprise in the town. For most people that might be enough, but the people in Hastings, for them it's just the first thing. They're already taking over a 9-storey office block and turning it into mixed housing, business and community use. And sometimes that's the thing about community enterprise and community asset ownership. Once you start, you can't stop. Again, who's heard of Manchester United? A few years back, when the Glazer family took over Manchester United, there were a lot of fans who were very upset. So a lot of fans decided to set up their own community-owned football club. And they set up FC United of Manchester. And it was largely funded through community shares. The fans all bought a share in the new company. And they've now built a new football stadium, which is at the heart of the community in which it's based. And equally importantly, they're doing really well. They get promoted every year. And who knows, another 5 or 10 years, they might be playing Manchester United. All of those examples I gave you, I could have given you dozens and dozens more examples of locality members. For me, there are 4 key words about them. Small, local, open, and connected. This is a quote from Ezio Manzini, Professor of Industrial Design at Milan Polytechnic. He's one of the world's leading experts around design and communities. And as he points out, small, local, open and connected are key factors in developing resilient systems and sustainable qualities. Small, local, open and connected works. If you look at those 4 words, small, local, open and connected, and you push them a bit further, I think it shows that what we need most today is a rebuilding of democratic culture and the strengthening of civil institutions that generate and expand democracy in politics, social life and above all the economy. We once had a Prime Minister in the UK called Margaret Thatcher. Her big slogan was, "There is no alternative." And that is what governments across Europe are saying now. There is no alternative to austerity, cutting living standards, cutting public spending. But small, local, open and connected is providing an alternative. We've seen this in Greece, in Spain, in Portugal, Italy, Ireland, even in Germany. But we've also seen it in growing interest in the cooperative movement, the social and solidarity economy, the degrowth movement, in peer production, the sharing economy, collaborative consumption, and in the movement around the commons. This is one manifestation, Ecuador's Buen Vivir. It means good living, but it's within the context of a community. It's very exciting. If you don't know about Buen Vivir, Google it and read about it. And as I say, all those things, all those new ways of thinking and doing are characterized by those 4 words, small, local, open and connected. Increasingly we're seeing experimentation, usually small-scale experimentation, around the world. Experimentation which isn't about conventional politics or public policy. Instead, it's about building systems for meeting everyday needs outside the market and the state. It is practically minded and reality-based. It's a grassroots, do-it-yourself, take charge of our future kind of movement. It's about people who are determined to open up new social and political spaces in which people can make their own rules, negotiate their own governance, and craft solutions that are tailored to local circumstances. It's about people being free to contribute their creativity on a decentralised, horizontal scale. They don't need to remain disengaged consumers or alienated citizens.
Listen.
Yeah, read that.
네, 그냥 한글로 말씀드리겠습니다. 그래서 모든 사람들의 니즈가 충족되는 그런 공동체를 한번 상상해 보시기 바랍니다. 사람들이 그래서 본인들이 공유하고 서로를 지지할 수 있는 그런 개인적인 선택을 할 수 있고, 그리고 이제 공공의 선을 위해서 서로 협력을 할 수 있기 때문에 이런 모두의 니즈가 충족이 되는 그런 공동체 말입니다. 그리고 다양성과 차이가 환영받는 그런 공동체, 지역 주민들이 어떤 공동체 자산을 소유하고 운영하는 그런 공동체. 그렇게 해서 주민을 고용하고 어떤 돈이 지역 공동체 내에서 순환될 수 있도록 하고 또 이제 신선한 어떤 지역의 음식들을 그 모든 사람들이 이용할 수 있고 또 육아라든지 그리고 저렴한 주택이라든지 교통 서비스라든지 하는 것들이 풍요로운 사회를 한번 상상을 해보시기 바랍니다. 그리고 사람들이 그런 공공 서비스를 어떻게 설계하고 그리고 어떻게 제공을 하는지 스스로 결정할 수 있는 사회, 그리고 공공 분야의 예산과 그 예산을 어떻게 쓰여야 되는지를 스스로 결정할 수 있는 사회, 그리고 양질의 시설이 젊은 사람 그리고 노인을 위해서도 존재하고 예술이나 문화가 번영하고 에너지가 지역에서 창출이 돼서 지역 니즈를 충족시키고 에너지 효율성 관련된 어떤 조치들이 시행이 되는 그런 공동체를 한번 상상해 보십시오. 또 사람들이 어떤 투자 자원을 공동체 주식이라는 형태를 통해서 창출을 해내고 그리고 공동체 채권을 통해서 창출해내고 그리고 직접 본인들의 그 돈을 서로 상호 간에 대출을 해주고 신용협동조합 같은 것들을 통해서 또 지역 통화를 통해서 서로 투자를 하는 그런 공동체를 한번 상상해 보시기 바랍니다.
No, because everything in there already exists in reality. Everything we've imagined exists somewhere. There's a community somewhere in the world that is doing one or other of those things. What no one has done is to try to bring all of those things together into a single community. We know all those things can work. We know all those things do work. The challenge, perhaps, as I say, is to bring them together into one place. One last slide. It's a quote from Buckminster Fuller, the architect and designer. He said, "You never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete." And I think that's what we're all trying to do, build a new model. There are no easy answers. I don't think there's a blueprint. But our challenge is to help make people creative, to encourage ideas, to incubate ideas, to play the game of making better places, to experiment and try small things that will eventually make big changes. And really important, I think, is to have fun while you're doing it. For me, the starting point of that change is the neighbourhood, it's the local. Now that might seem a bit old-fashioned, but I think it's like an internet cafe, where you can have two people communicating with New Zealand and Morocco, or London and Seoul, but in between they're talking to each other. That's the world we now live in. For me, the mark of a 21st century person is somebody who steps forward into the whole world with one foot, but keeps their other foot rooted in their community. Even as our economic and intellectual horizons broaden, the local community is still where we live our lives, where our feet are on the ground, where our families live and our friends live. But for me, being rooted in your community, even if it's not where you were born or brought up, but being rooted in your community, I think gives firm foundations for creating change. Change is needed and it is time for change. There are proven solutions, and community asset ownership and community enterprise are just two of those. But these solutions can be created by ordinary people who become extraordinary by taking action. And I know that's true. I just have to look around and see what I've seen in the last 2 days. In my experience, there are extraordinary people everywhere. We perhaps just have to try and help them realise it. Thank you.